Hello, students. Welcome to AILET 2024 analysis. I hope the paper was brilliant, paper was awesome. You enjoyed the experience because after the CLAT paper, which was quite easy, AILET was somewhere in between. Not as easy as CLAT, not as difficult as you would expect a AILET paper to be, but something that you would have expected, something that did not surprise you, something that you would have sailed through had you been serious in your preparation. Uh, there were no surprises, unlike last year, where we were surprised with when English section and the logical section were clubbed together in one passages. This time they went back to the old format where there were segregations. There were English section 50 questions, logical reasoning 70 questions, and general knowledge 30 questions. Also, there was no such question that you would not have come across, in the sense they were predictable questions. There were no unique questions. There were no experimentations as such. Even in general knowledge and current affairs sections, there were the kind of questions that you would have come across had you been reading newspapers, had you been going across the newspapers, articles, the things that were covered in the last year. So today's session, if you are joining live, you can shoot your questions, you can share your experiences, you can tell me how many questions you attempted, what are you expecting, how was your expectation from the paper, and your attempts, your what you feel about the paper as a student, as a candidate who wrote the paper. And what we will be doing is, as an experts, the experts members in our team, we will be analyzing the paper, the difficulty level, the type of questions, and how different was it from last year, what you can expect, whether NLU Delhi will accept you with which score, what is the expected cutoff, all those things that we are going to discuss in this live analysis. So we have our expert faculty with us. We have English faculty, we have the logical reasoning, we will be discussing with legal issues, legal section also, other sections also. There was no quant this time, there was no mathematics this time, so that is not required this time. But all other experts with their expertise will discuss the paper in detail with you, and you can share your experience also, how you felt about the paper and what you can add to that. Now, a general overview: the increase in duration from 90 minutes to 120 minutes was a relief. Earlier, 150 questions in 90 minutes was a huge challenge. This time, you could have managed it easily because you can spend time in reading the passages. Even if the passages are lengthy, you had that liberty, you had that luxury to understand, comprehend, and devote time what is required. So there is no section that will be left out, there is no question that will be left out. The question could, the whole paper could easily be completed in 2 hours. There were lesser number of passages in English section. There were only 7 passages this time. Logical reasoning section was a mix of critical reasoning and analytical reasoning. There were hardly 10 legal reasoning questions. Actually, there were only 8 legal reasoning questions, and 2 more questions were a mix of legal and critical reasoning and legal and analytical reasoning. As far as quant is concerned, there were 0 questions from quant. As far as uh, general knowledge is concerned, there were straightforward direct questions that was a mix of current as well as a statistic. However, general knowledge this time covered all types of questions. There were questions from international affairs, a huge number of questions, at least 11 questions from international affairs. There were questions from economics, there were questions from business, there were questions from uh, all all the essentially all the areas, awards and prizes, all the areas that you are expected to know. Unlike CLAT this time had RC type of general knowledge section. AILET tested your knowledge and all type of knowledge, and that included your science knowledge, that included your the things that I mentioned: economics, business, and international affairs. So in short, it was a moderate paper, and we will go section by section in detail by the people who are expert in that. And starting with the English section that had 50 questions, that had no surprises, that had 7 passages with uh, the more detail of it will be discussed by our expert faculty, the head of department of English, Lakshmi ma'am. Here, ma'am.
Thank you, Nitin. Hi, students. Hope you had a good exam today. Okay, as Nitin sir just told you, there were no surprises this time in AILET. It was a very doable paper overall. Yeah, and the pattern was similar to AILET 2022, actually, because they went back to the traditional pattern of passage based reading comprehension. Unlike last year, when they had the same passage for logical reasoning, critical reasoning, quant based reasoning, legal reasoning. So that last year came as a huge surprise, but this year they went back to the old pattern. Okay, so let us start with the English section. English section was purely comprehension based. Okay, so when we say comprehension based, there were 7 passages, 7 reading comprehension passages, and unlike in 2022, okay, when they had a mix of stories, interviews, etc., this year the passages were very conventional in nature and, interestingly, very similar to the CLAT passages in terms of content, difficulty level, length, etc. They were very much on the lines of CLAT passages. Compared to last year, the passages were more or less the same length. Okay, some were lengthier, some were shorter, but there were fewer passages. And remember, the overall time this time was 120 minutes. So definitely it was an advantage. Okay, so now looking at the passages one by one, the first passage was on linguistics. Okay, it was a moderate read, I would say, and fairly lengthy too, but not very difficult in terms of language. Language was normal. Okay, there were 6 questions based on this passage, mostly inference type questions and a few direct detailed questions. As usual, AILET is in the habit of giving vocabulary based, contextual vocabulary based questions. So those questions were very much a part of this paper too. In the first passage, we had some such questions. Okay. The next passage was on the pursuit of validation through accolades, that is, through awards, certificates, competitions, etc. Now, though the concept is familiar, it could have been more of an abstract read. Okay, the concept of getting validation through accolades could have been a bit abstract for some students. Uh, Language was okay, language was easy to read, and there were 10 questions based on this passage. Again, the same kind of questions, inference based, specific detail based, vocabulary based questions. Okay, now the third passage was actually an excerpt from a writer's work. Okay, it was on the concept of perfectionism in creative writing. Now, this was also an easy read, not very difficult to read. There were 6 questions based on this passage. One thing we noticed is that there were a few critical reasoning questions also in this time's reading comprehension section. Okay, a few critical reasoning questions like strengthening, weakening, etc. Yeah. Uh, so that is the perfectionism passage. There was an interesting question here on the sequence of events that led to a particular result. Okay, that was an interesting but very easy question to handle. Then the next passage was on mental health in colleges, in campuses, and we had only 5 questions based on this passage, mostly critical reasoning kind of questions. Very easy read, actually. The passage was very easy to relate to. The next passage was a short and sweet passage on electric vehicles. Um, Sorry, I skipped one passage in between, right? The one on medical education. Okay, that is virtual reality in medical education. This passage, though the passage was easy, the questions were, there were 10 in number, slightly. If you want to look for tricky questions in this paper, then maybe these were the tricky ones, but those were also actually quite straightforward in nature. Okay, not very difficult. Then, the short and sweet passage on electric vehicles. This one had 7 questions. Again, very direct questions, actually, surprisingly, for such a short passage. So, this passage, I hope all of you read the entire passage and attempted all the questions too. Then the last passage we had was on the concept of community in specifically with reference to villages. This was also a very short passage with 5 questions. Okay, mostly critical reasoning questions. Here, the critical reasoning questions also had fairly straightforward options. Okay, so for most students with an average reading speed, once you finished reading the passages, eliminating the options would have been a cakewalk. Maybe out of the 50 questions, in 5 to 6 questions, there were tricky options. That's it. So, a good student, an excellent student may have answered all the questions. A good student would have answered, I'm sure, 40 questions approximately. That should be doable. Okay, so this is the reading comprehension section. Now, let us move on to the critical reasoning section. Critical reasoning, that is the logical reasoning section, um, had 70 questions in all. Okay, 70 questions in all. And out of that, 33 questions were from what we call critical reasoning. What is critical reasoning? Your usual assumptions, inferences, conclusions, absolutely predictable paper there in critical reasoning. In terms of the types of questions, in terms of the level of difficulty, absolutely no surprises. Critical reasoning can be a little tricky for most students, right? Just by the nature of that entity called critical reasoning, it requires you to get a little critical there. So, by that logic, yes, some of the questions were slightly challenging, but the first few questions on assumptions were throwaway questions. You just had the answer on a platter. Then, in between, some of the questions got a little complicated. And then again, there were easy questions. So, here the only challenge was, since this time we did not have many questions based on a passage, there were a couple of sets like that, but majority of the questions were individual questions. So the trick was to quickly see whether a question was doable or not, and then skip it if it was not doable without wasting too much time on it. But I'm sure most students would have managed that. So out of the 33 questions, 20 to 22 questions, I'm sure, were very, very doable. Okay, this is the analysis of the critical reasoning section. Now we have the next part of logical reasoning, which is analytical reasoning. So we have our in house logical reasoning expert, Karthik, an alumnus of IIM, to talk to you. Over to you, Karthik.
Thank you, ma'am. Uh, with respect to the logical reasoning question, compared to last year, it was slightly easier in terms of the difficulty. So I'll just briefly give you a distribution of the kind of questions across the topics. So what we had was we had 6 questions from arrangements. So in arrangements, there were 2 questions that were strictly seating arrangement based. One was a regular linear arrangement. The other one was a circular arrangement. Apart from that, uh, you had four questions which were based on scheduling, and someone one of the names that you would have heard for this topic would have been ordering and sequencing or distribution. So these questions were not that difficult. These questions were moderate. One of the advantages with questions of this nature is you had, out of the 4 options given, you could have just gone to the possible sequences given in the 4 options and tried to validate them instead of trying to solve the entire question right from the conditions given. If you notice that uh, for a lot of questions, at least 2 options were easy to eliminate. Just to give you an example, one of the conditions given in the questions would have been A and B cannot sit together. And if you look at the options, out of 4 options, one of the options had A and B sitting together. So something like that was common across these 6 questions, and students who tried to solve it purely based on the conditions would have taken a little bit more time. The easier approach would have been to validating the options, because the conditions were pretty straightforward, they were not difficult to understand, and validating would not have taken a lot of time. So that would have left students enough time to go for other questions in other sections as well. So that was with respect to arrangement. Next, you had a good number of questions from syllogisms. You had close to 13 or 14 questions from syllogisms. And you have two approaches for syllogisms. One is the tick cross approach, and the other one is a Venn diagrams approach. The tick cross approach would have been a little complicated for, statements where there were, questions where there were more than two statements. Someone who's well versed with the Venn diagrams approach could have gotten most of the questions right. And a lot of these have been covered in the basic handouts, and even the difficult questions that you've seen in the paper, these things have been covered in our basic handout. So anyone who's practiced syllogisms well enough would have scored really really well. It was not that difficult. And the next part is the coding and the decoding aspects. These questions were pretty simple. One of the, I think students like to, attempt questions of this sort because it sort of, stimulates their mind, in an interesting manner. And the questions given, you had close to four questions, and all four questions did not pose significant difficulty in terms of, coming up with a pattern. If you could not, let's say you're going from left to right with respect to the pattern given, if you're not able to immediately come up with something, if you just looked at individual letters, like you have A is to B is to C is to D, something like that. Let's say that is the template. So the first letter in A, the first letter in B, the first letter in C, that also could have given you a conclusive pattern, which would have made the questions, which would have made solving the questions pretty easy. So that was about it. And and in the end, you had one analytical reasoning passage. Now this passage was a little difficult because if you look at the information given, or the common information that you had in the beginning, understanding the context was not that difficult. The language also was not too complicated. So the scenario, or basically understanding what's happening there, that part was easy. The context part was easy to understand. Where the difficulty was with respect to the questions. So the questions were a little bit tricky, and they were options. Each of the four questions had at least two options which were very very close to each other, and that sort of made it difficult. And even if you tried eliminating one or two options, you still had to deal with two options, and correctly picking the right answer would have, it was a little tricky. So students could have probably skipped this one or saved this for the end. But in the reasoning part, this was the most difficult aspect. So the major scoring part was the syllogism questions and the arrangements, as well as the coding decoding part. Okay, thank you guys. I'm handing it over to Nitin sir.
Right. So, as far as the extension of logical reasoning, since AILET has this wide interpretation of logical reasoning, that includes your critical reasoning, analytical reasoning, legal reasoning, and last year they included quant also. But let's start with legal reasoning first. Compared to CLAT, that heavily dedicates, at least like this year, they dedicated 32 questions, law related questions in the legal reasoning section. AILET has very small weightage of that. This time they had 8 questions that were the traditional principle fact based question that we are used to have, in the previous CLAT papers, like older CLAT papers and the previous AILET papers. Those kind of questions were there, and the topics were pretty basic. There were topics like criminal trespass. Now everybody who has attended our classes or gone to our handouts knows what a trespass is, knows what criminal trespass is, knows the elements, knows and can easily apply the principle in the given fact situation. Then there were topics like vicarious liability, and 3 principles were given, and at least 4 questions were there based on the same concept of vicarious liability. Once you know the concept, once you know what is vicarious liability, you could have easily got all the 4 questions right. So, criminal trespass, vicarious liability, pretty basic questions that any serious candidate preparing for law entrance examination definitely knows how to apply these concepts. So, I won't say that legal part was challenging. It was doable, quite doable, and most of the candidates must have got it right. There were 2 more questions. I would say there were 10 questions, 8 plus 2. Why I'm saying 8 plus 2 is 8 direct application of law. 2 questions was a mix of legal and reasoning, in a sense that the topic they chose was legal in nature. They were talking about law of tort. However, they did not use the concept, any legal concept of tort. The topic might be about tort, but the questions had nothing to do with tort. The questions were to do with the reasoning of the passage that talked about tort. So that could be categorized as either legal or a basic general reasoning passage. Then there was another that had things uh, about constitution, but nothing to do with law as such. Legal knowledge was not required. So in general, 10 questions that talked about law, 8 questions that needed application of law, and that was all about legal aspect of in this law entrance examination. Ironically, majority of the section focused on reasoning, basic reasoning that sir and ma'am just discussed about the critical reasoning section and the analytical reasoning type of questions that dominated the paper in that 70 questions of logical reasoning section. Coming to the passage, the section that has the least weightage, that is the general knowledge, that had again predictable questions. There were questions that were not very current and somewhere in between. I'll give you an example. We were expecting was Israel-Palestine conflict, and what they asked was Russia-Ukraine crisis. Now, Russia-Ukraine crisis was expected last year, and they are asking it this year. So that was the mismatch, but they covered it, and it was expected. The current questions that we predicted was, one question was regarding the Kavach. Now, due to that Odisha accident, that was very much in news. There were so many details or discussions about it. What is it? Where it is used? And the question was very easy. So anyone who had been following news or in general who had been aware, even in social media or otherwise, would know about it. Then there were questions about the Booker Prize. There were questions. There was a few very easy questions like which of the following did not win the Nobel Prize, and very famous names for there like Amartya Sen and Mother Teresa, and one name was Mahatma Gandhi. So people would naturally know that Mahatma Gandhi never got the Nobel Prize. So these were the questions. There were some questions that every candidate would know. However, there were some questions that required in-depth study, at least of some of the topics. For example, there were questions about BRICS, that which of the following countries is the the latest entrant of BRICS, which one joined the latest. Although even that was not difficult, but maybe some candidates might have struggled with such questions. Other than that, there were a lot of questions on international affairs. There were questions from G20. There were questions from Conference of Parties 26. There were questions from uh, a lot of international affairs, including the Israel Palestine was also touched upon in the historical context. They talked about one of the agreements that was related, but it's not in news right now, but that goes back in the history of the current conflict. So the GK section was a mix of current as well as the static, and the questions were such that the context was current, but the answer that was required that was static in nature. The context would be that okay, this happened in 2023 or 2022, but the question that will follow that context will require you to have a static knowledge of the past, or uh, that was not something that you would have come across in this year in regular discussion that required. So that is why I'm using the word a mix of static and current again and again. Then there were some very basic questions regarding IPL, that if those who are interested in cricket and in general, they would have easily got it irrespective of their academic uh, commitment to general knowledge section. There were questions like there were questions where that catered to an audience. Most of the candidates would have got out of 30 at least 20 plus right, because if they have been studying, following the newspapers, like we always suggest, follow the Hindu, follow the Indian Express, go through the handouts that we give you. Those handouts covered Israel Palestine conflict, those handouts covered a conference of parties, those handouts covered a lot of topics, especially, and some general questions, which is the longest river in India, that too we throw out randomly, we give these every candidate who is appearing for these competitive examination goes through these basic trivias, so to say, that were tested. So not very unpredictable. Any serious candidate would have expected this kind of paper, would have been ready for this paper, and I hope you got most of it right. It remains to be seen how everybody has performed. The feedback will start coming. We have also uploaded a feedback of other students. Was most of the candidates found the overall paper moderate, and there were no surprises in none of the sections, be it logical reasoning, be it English section, be it general knowledge section. General knowledge was predictable, logical reasoning was predictable, English was not as difficult as we expect from a AILET level paper, because we always put AILET at a higher pedestal when compared to CLAT. CLAT is always easier than AILET, and the same thing happened here also. But since CLAT was so easy, AILET also toned down in the same proportion this time. So this is the overall analysis, in the sense that you know in detail what to expect from English section, from each of the questions, what to expect from the other sections. If we talk about we have already talked about the overall difficulty level of this section. General knowledge section, difficulty level moderate. English and the other aspects of logical reasoning we have already discussed. Legal reasoning, difficulty level, again moderate is the word that I will say again and again to highlight this paper. Somewhere in between, not easy, not difficult, moderate was this AILET 2024. The topics covered we already discussed. The topics that were completely absent, again I will re-emphasize that some of the very expected topics, say for example topics regarding Chandrayaan, topics regarding some of the latest thing that were expected, the kind of topics CLAT covered very predictable topics that we were 100% sure that passages will appear, and the passages were there. In AILET, the topics were slightly out of date, slightly older than the current paper, slightly sometimes uh, some geography questions, some economics questions, some basic economics questions about GDP, about CRR, what is cash reserve ratio, what is GDP. Now, these are economic topics that a candidate knows in general if he has this habit of reading newspaper and has a basic level of awareness. So these economic topics, business topics, there were which of the following CEOs is not of Indian origin. Now, these are some interesting questions that you anyway know out of interest, even otherwise your academic inclination towards general knowledge. So those were some basic doable questions in general knowledge. This was the I just discussed all these points about the overall difficulty, moderate. I'll keep saying again and again. We have already covered other sections. So that is about the overall AILET 2024 experience or feedback from the students, what we noticed after going through the paper, what our experts noticed. So we feel that out of 150, if you end up getting say 90 plus or maybe 95 plus, there is a good chance that you might get a call from National University Delhi. However, a detailed written analysis with other pros and cons and other factors that will be taken into consideration, that will be uploaded in our website. Uh, Go to the website and see this time for education.com. We have a detailed analysis coming up before in some time, that will be uploaded. That will give you a fair idea about the exact cutoffs, the cutoff in each of the areas, and the overall cutoff to get into National University Delhi. So thank you so much. Hope this was helpful. And now you can relax a bit, because last Sunday you gave CLAT, this Sunday was AILET, and this has been a hectic week. You can relax now and wait for the results. And today CLAT is also declaring the results. So all the best for that, and best of luck. Goodbye.